Have a seat, guys. Now I gotta say, I've been looking forward to this conversation for the last couple of weeks because the three of you are in the sometimes unenviable position of being stuck between the startups and the enterprise and trying to make all of this work out. And you're doing it on 3 different continents, in Europe, in Japan, and in the United States. So I think we're going to get some really interesting perspectives on the differences and what's more important, sometimes the similarities between startups and large companies working together around the world. So let's just get into it. First of all, from the startup perspective. So enterprises tend to have a slower decision-making process. A lot of them don't tend to be new adopters of technology. So looking at from the startup point of view, how soon should a startup really think about working with large corporations? Don, what's been your experience?
Sure. In America, large corporations are frequent early adopters of startup technologies. So if you have a startup in America that is focused on the business market, of course you'll be knocking on the doors from day one. And what we do at the Accelerator program is we help the companies kind of pre-sell that this accelerator is only running for 3 months. So we tell the business unit heads and stuff like, hey, listen, you can't have a meeting in 2 months and then follow up after 3 months. We're going to try to accelerate the track. So we kind of pre-sell at the corporation that we're going to have all these startups coming in. They're going to try to set up meetings. Let's try to do quick turnarounds and make decisions on, is this a technology that you want to purchase for your division? And so when we're working with the corporate sponsor, we've already talked to the business units, and they kind of know that this is a quicker turnaround situation, and we've prepped the company and the business unit managers. So, and again, in America, it's very typical for startups to go knocking on the doors of big companies, and for the big companies to try out their product. They're very open to experimenting with new products from young companies.
Okay. And Oscar, what's been your experience? Is there ever a stage where it's too early to start thinking or start trying to work with larger companies?
Well, I guess that many people worry about speed, right? So if you have startups, they have high speed, and typically corporations have a lower speed. But the thing is that if you look at, there's a typical point where they meet and they can work together. So if let's say the first year there is too much going on within the startup to start bothering about where they should meet or connect. But I guess that if you look at speed, if you see that, I always say, if you have a company with the name Rockstart, you get to grow your hair, you wear black T-shirts, and you make a lot of noise. And look at it. So I'm wearing a shirt today, and I see the people of this conference are wearing black T-shirts. So things are picking up really fast. And the speed thing is just, I guess that where accelerators are really good at is to see where the founders are at what stage they're really ready to engage with large corporations, because we know them from almost birth. They enter our accelerators anywhere in the world at, let's say, somewhere in the first 1,000 days, 2 or 3 years, and they're playing with the product. And until it is a running product, they shouldn't be bothered by either the large corporations and vice versa. At some point, it makes a lot of sense, and then it can go really fast.
So I've seen this at a certain, so Don, you were saying that you sort of prep the startups, or you prep the corporates to expect a faster decision making, so it's not as much of a drain on the startup's resources. Has your experience been it's more effective just to kind of have the startups wait until they can deal with the enterprise decision making?
Well, you don't want them to slow down, and you can't expect a larger corporation to pick up to run at the same speed. So what you see happening in many places in Europe and on other continents is large corporations as well as governments and cities and countries having startup officers that sort of speak their language and interface between what's happening at the different speeds. It's like gearing. It's just making sure that people know how and when to gear, I guess.
Okay. Yeah. And Sorato, what have you found in Japan?
Our focus is on the growth stage startup, which already have a prototype at least, and have done some market validation realistically, of course, and they should have some customers already. And at least in Japan, I think it doesn't really make sense for startup to go, try to go from 0 to 1 step with the enterprise company, unless enterprise company, have really close relationship with a startup, like having board members and being able to capable of incubating startups. I mean, it doesn't really, the enterprise don't simply have that, such capability here. So, I mean, the most of the time. So that, I think so that growth stage startup are the best option with the highest chance of success for both startups and enterprises.
Okay.
And the startups that I was talking about were growth stage startups.
Growth stage startups. Okay.
They have a product out, they have tested it with customers, and it's a stabilized product. It's not like something that's going to waste people's time.
Because it would seem to me like before that, there's nothing a large company can do with the product other than say, well, that seems like a good idea.
Yeah, give feedback. In other words, they just give feedback to the value proposition in a kind of oral way. You don't try the product out, you just give feedback on what's going on.
Sorato, I'm curious, you've been working with many, many large Japanese companies, some of whom are in the room today.
Yep.
Have you been able to get the Japanese companies to speed up their decision-making process in the way that Don was talking about?
Yeah.
A little?
What do you think, Tim?
I think it seems to me from working at different places that it's more necessary and more difficult to speed up the decision-making process in Japan. It's the most larger US companies can make a decision very quickly with very few people involved, where most Japanese firms require at least 2 or 3 levels of approval for any significant commitment to a startup. So, well, aside from the size, have you found that a particular type of industry is well suited for collaboration? So all of my past startups have been business-to-business software startups. So naturally, I was trying to knock on enterprise doors from day one because I was out trying to make sales. But putting aside the opportunity for sales to the company, are there particular types of startups that should be trying to collaborate with large enterprises early? And are there certain types that should maybe avoid that and try to build the market themselves?
Well, maybe I can illustrate this with a good example. It doesn't have to be a bigger corporation waiting for a startup and vice versa to work with each other, because what happens also, and what we at Rockstart help exist, is the spin-outs of companies. So we had an example of a large company we all know, Sony Music, who was sort of looking at the field of where Spotify is. It's one of their biggest channels, but still they were looking at a competitive product. And they had a couple of people working within the company, and they spun out. So the people of Rockstart helped them get the company out. They lived with us for a while, and they built the product. And then they had the freedom outside of the company to find out what it means to build a company. And I guess that one of the things that's really important for this discussion is, if you talk about startups and large companies, it's not a large company, it's just a larger thing of the smaller company called a startup. A startup is not a company. A startup is a small experiment taking big risks in order to find a sustainable business model. And this is not what you do in a larger corporation. You cannot play with the process and see what happens. So it's looking at it from an experiment point of view. Try it. If it doesn't work inside, put it outside. And there are many, many places, also here in Tokyo, that I've seen that you can house a company of 5 to 10 to 25 people to start building a company. And whether it works or not doesn't really matter. The fact that it happens and people can look at it and experience and share what happens in this process, I think the main thing. And then many industries are easier if you have, so what we always say is like everything that's innovation driven, technology oriented, globally scalable, those are the types of companies that are easy to accelerate. And if it's hardware, it's harder. If it's physical locations, it's even harder, but everything that's technology oriented would be, I guess, fit for a thing like that.
So what you're saying is anything, Rockstart in particular is looking for these companies that do have the potential to scale massively and make a global impact. So almost by definition, large companies should be interested in those types of startups, regardless of industry niche.
What you see now after 6 years, so we were preaching in an empty desert 6 years ago, and people were like, yeah, startups, no money involved, why bother? And now you see that if you look at it closely, but let it happen, you can learn so much from it. Instead of trying to mimic it within the company and spending all these resources to look cool, startup-y style, and et cetera, just make sure that it happens outside, and then at some point try to guide it in. And that's why a startup officer is really a good idea to guide that process. And
It's like New York Times, huh?
like the New York Times, a good example. The New York Times, they built this massive, beautiful building in the middle of Manhattan, and I don't know when it was built, but when it was done, so they were moving in, and just before they went in, there were less people working at the New York Times than expected. So they had a couple of floors not used. And what they said is, okay, everyone involved in media, innovation, technology can live and work here, can work in this place, and the only thing that we ask for them is to be able to look over their shoulders to see what's happening, and they learn from that. And still, I think New York Times is still, it's a good place in terms of innovation. Yeah.
That's a great project. Do you know if anything concrete came out of it, whether it was acquisitions or funding or?
I don't know. This has been going on for 10 years, and there's many things that spun out, but you see it every day in the New York Times. They're like, New York Times is really very much experimenting with any type of thing, what you don't see in the interface, but there's many things that spun out of that.
Well, they certainly are one of the few old media companies that is doing well in the digital age. They've made the transition much better than most. Don, what do you think? Are there certain types of startups that should look at collaboration early, and certain types that maybe should avoid thinking too hard about collaboration with enterprise?
Yeah, I think there's the startup point of view and the big company point of view. And I think from the big company point of view, startups internally are very tough to manage if they're staying in the business unit and I've got my quarterly numbers to meet. And so, as Oscar just mentioned, one of the real benefits to having startups, the sponsor of our accelerator was Kaplan Education, and they published a bunch of different educational materials. They run test prep centers and all that type of stuff. They had over 30 startups internally once they counted them up. Like, they didn't really know how many startups were internally at their organization. But when they actually did the head count, there were 31 different efforts to start companies within Kaplan. Some of those efforts were like 5 years long. They had spent millions of dollars, and they still didn't have a product. And they didn't really know that. It just got kind of set in the budget, and they just got the same money every year because it was budgeted. And what they decided to do was embed a startup in our accelerator program. So we had a bunch of external startups. And then what Kaplan did is they took one of their startups internally called Grocket, and they embedded it in our accelerator program with all the external entrepreneurs. And it was a wonderful experience because they took those entrepreneurs, internal entrepreneurs, they took them out of the business unit and let them now try to start up their company with a bunch of other people, with mentors, and take advantage of the entire accelerator, access to mentors and lean startup methodology know-how. And they did much better. The company within that 3-month period, really saw what it meant to speed.
Yep.
And one of the, and so from a big company's point of view, I think it's really important to like try to move your startups to the edge of the organizations,
Yep.
not within a business unit where
It
they have to
happens on
report
the
to the
edges,
boss.
right?
It,
Always,
it happens in the edges, and so I really believe that's the best way to do it. And then the other advantage of the big company, especially at Kaplan, is when they had mentors to the Accelerator program and ran the Accelerator program, the CEO of the company invited only the high performers at the company to be mentors. So it was kind of an honor to participate in the Accelerator program. And that made it much more exciting for the people. Like, oh yeah, I'm a mentor to the program because I was a high performer within the big organization. And those executives, I think we had like 100 executives, it was like culture shock. So when they were spending time at the Accelerator and they would mentor the companies, they would get assigned permanently with the one company that they liked the most. And they saw how quickly that company moved from day 1 of the Accelerator to day 60 or 90 of the Accelerator. And it was almost like culture shock, like, geez, how come we can't do that? And it was really good organizational kind of, instead of hiring McKinsey for a month to tell you need to do this, go show them what goes on. And they were kind of shocked into, wow, how come we're not doing this? What do we need to do more in order to move that quickly inside of our organization? So those were 2 big benefits by the organization, was to put their startups in there so they could learn those techniques and what it took like. And then also just the whole organization and all the mentors, even if it wasn't a startup, really got to see the innards of startups moving quickly and how they were making decisions. So it was a really good organizational shock therapy.
This is something I want to dig into a little bit later, but I'm curious, in that situation, it sounds like an incredible learning opportunity for the executives of that company. But in that particular case, were they able to take what they learned within this Accelerator environment and then replicate it, then transfer that knowledge back inside the corporate environment with all the rules and the controls? Were they actually able to execute on any of this?
So in the Kaplan situation, it was kind of a stepped process. So the first thing that they did is just all the executive team, so I would say it was about 120 top executives that got invited to be mentors to the program. Each one of those spent time with the things, and initially it was more just like, wow, how come my project teams don't move like this and we don't get things accomplished with this kind of startup juice or entrepreneur juice? And I don't think it translated initially. Like, in other words, there was mostly just kind of a wake up, like, hey, we could do things differently here. There's no reason we can't do this. And I think that's kind of step number 1, is this kind of awareness building. And then, yes, what Kaplan started to do after that was say, okay, what do we do and what can we do in a more systematic, planful way to start to bring that type of open innovation and the external world getting exposed to that? Now, how do we internally start to figure out how do we act more entrepreneurial in the way we go about building businesses, building new products, making decisions? So it definitely didn't happen all at once.
All right. Yeah. Well, there has been, certainly in Japan over the last 5 years, but 5 years especially, the last 10 years in particular, a increased desire by large companies to work with startups. So, I mean, I remember when I started my first company here back in 1998, if I wanted to do business with a large company, I would have been pushed down through like 4 levels of subcontractors. It was impossible to get approved as a vendor. And that's changed here in Japan. The US and Europe, large companies have always been a little more open, but it's had that same difficulty, an impedance mismatch, if you will. So from your clients, what are the large companies really looking for when they're trying to work with startups? And do they really know what they're looking for when they approach you for like an open innovation program? Do you want to?
Who are you directing it to?
I'll direct it at you.
Okay, good. Sorry, you have to repeat the last part of the question because I was wondering.
So for example, most of the companies who approach you who want to work with the startups, what is their motivation? Do they have a clear idea and a clear objective, or are they just trying to think that they want to get some of this innovation stuff and bring it home?
What I've learned in working with large and small companies is that we think that large companies know exactly what they're doing and startups don't. Well, none of them knows exactly what they're doing, so they sort of want to get infected. And one of the good things about this opening up this startup culture, and one of the things I liked of your story is there are two things that large companies can really learn from accelerators, which is mentorship and peer-to-peer coaching. Because if you have startups, I call that the Wagamama effect, like people sitting next to each other at a table, and they just help each other because they know someone who's doing something in South America, blah, blah, blah. And that is the peer-to-peer structure, that's the glue, and the mentorship that is super important because it's people. You see people getting infected by this virus of, I don't know what it is, but there's something going on. And it's like, if you have someone like building a small fire and they're like doing it, it always attracts people. And then sometimes it builds up and it attracts more people. And this is what you need. So I think the most important thing is to make sure that people get sort of infected by it and are drawn to it instead of given homework to innovate. You know, Steve Jobs always said, if you have a company that has an innovation department, it doesn't work. It has to be in anyone in the company. Everyone should be infected by the Think Different virus. So it is, the structure has to be in every cell of the company, and it starts with engagement and people having fun being attracted to it. So that's I think, the most prominent thing to be. It's supposed to be interesting, inspiring, fun, sometimes exciting, but that is the way. It doesn't, if it feels like homework, it probably doesn't work to start with.
Okay. Sorato, with the large Japanese companies you work with, how do you get them to realize what they want, what the objectives of the program are?
We've run like corporate programs 80 times before in 5 years, and half of the time, like enterprise don't really have a specific objective or even like idea about like kinds of startup they want to work with. But it works perfectly well. So I mean, it's really about like defining the kind of startup who can benefit the most out of, who can benefit from those resources that the corporation have, and just reaching out to them. That's how we get the win-win situation on both sides.
So do you find that you are more often trying to define a specific benefit and specific KPI for a large company, for the client, or is the interaction with the startups, does that sort of rub off on them, and does that provide the benefit directly regardless of what the initial goals were?
Me?
Yeah.
Okay. It really depends, Depends. And half of the time we have to set the KPIs and stuff, and half the time it's just startup and enterprise can work together and just figure it out the way they can benefit each other.
And I think sometimes there's explicit goals and objectives, and then sometimes objectives just evolve that this was a benefit I didn't know about. Certainly, in our experience, when Kaplan came in, they were getting a little bit of a stodgy image. So one of the objectives they had was just a PR burst, because they're doing this cool things with startups. So it was good PR. They made announcements. They were in the press a lot. They became kind of a more sexy company because they were doing all this open innovation with startups. So there was a PR and marketing benefit for the company and for the brand of the company. There was also just, they were very interested in market intelligence. So, they're an education company and they wanted to know what's going on out in the entrepreneurial world with all these different startups and just help us make sense of it. So there was a lot of business intelligence and market intelligence. And then the other benefit that they really valued a lot was this whole idea of this organizational change. It was a change agent so that people started to say, wow, I can do this, and it's not a homework assignment. It's kind of fun to mentor these companies. And I'm learning more than they do by mentoring them. And I think that was the experience of the executives. So again, about 120 executives involved in mentorship. Originally, it kind of sounded like it might be homework. You know, I got to go do what, and I got to help these guys. But what they found was, wow, I'm getting so much more from the startup
They're involved.
than
Exactly.
I'm getting, and I'm getting involved, and it's fun, and I want to go back, and I want to mentor more, and they learned a lot by being a mentor.
Instead of protecting what you're used to, like,
Yes.
this is my silo, this is where I work at,
Yeah.
it's like sharing that.
And then the last thing is just the deal flow. They got access to acquisition, they got access to companies to serve their customers. So an example of one of these quick decisions that Kaplan made was one of the companies in the EdTech Accelerator in the first batch. They had a proctoring service that was an automated proctoring service. So they turned the computer into an intelligent box that would proctor and see if you were cheating or not. And Kaplan had a bunch of different nursing and healthcare certificate degrees. And they were remotely done. They're online, and you have no idea if the person who actually signed up for the course is taking it and getting the test scores, or are they cheating or not. So this startup technology was an automated proctoring. It didn't really matter if it was new and it was a startup or it was an old company. They needed this, and they purchased it. They were saying, I want you to be a proctor, an automated proctor, because the way we do it now is expensive and time-consuming for the customers. This is a better solution. So I'm happy to purchase it, and I'll give you a big purchase order. And so it was really a great win for the startup in the Accelerator program, because they got access to Kaplan's customers, and they got to, a big customer deal. And for Kaplan, it was like, of course I want to do this instead of the way I'm doing it. And it was a simple decision about what was the right thing to do. It wasn't like, oh, I have to figure out how to work out with a startup. It's like, was the value proposition of their product or service compelling enough for me to want to purchase it? It was that simple. It wasn't like I needed to figure out how the startup works and how I work and how we work together.
It's a great exchange, right?
It was just, it was a value exchange. They needed it, this startup had it, and they made a transaction.
So
and it happened quickly.
It sounds like, and it's surprising to me, but it sounds like that the real value of the collaboration, the large companies go into a collaboration, whether they go in with specific objectives and KPIs, or whether they go in with a very general objective of, this seems to be important, we want to learn something, both get kind of the same value out of it. Is that pretty much true across the board?
Totally. I think that if you know exactly what you want, you're limiting the discussion and the research, because there's no such thing in process like this as failure. It's just research and development, Keep trying until it works. So it's a big mess until it works. And if you're open to see what happens and see what you stumble upon while doing it, then new stuff happens. And I think that there's a very good example close to home here, close to Tokyo. Is one of the companies that I traveled with to Tokyo last December here in Tokyo. One of our Rockstart residents is a company called the Things Network, and they're in this long-range IoT networks. And they met a company here in Tokyo called Mirai Technology, Mirai IT. And that was last December. And they were open to it. So they were looking for an infrastructure, the Japanese company, and the Dutch company, which started a year earlier, was looking for a good test bed to see whether it really worked. And now they traveled back and forth for 5 times the last 3-4 months. And the founder of the company is moving to Tokyo for 2 months this summer to work on it, because this is a great test bed. Super high-end technology, people need it, they want it, there's a lot of competition. Can you ever imagine a founder, CEO of a company leaving home to do the testing in another continent? Well, for me, that is an example that you just don't know when you start. You can't limit it by some stuff that says, okay, we should do this and not do this. It is being open to it.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, what do you think that...
One quick addition that I will make is, there was another example, like that was a very effective startup that had a good success in selling their product to Kaplan and the company. There was another startup that had a service that was helping students understand what career they wanted, and Kaplan had distribution channels, and it was more of a strategic partnership. And this didn't work as well because Kaplan had a lot of things to sell. They're selling, SAT test prep. They're selling this type of test prep. So their salesmen had a big bag of things, of products and services that they're selling out there. And then they added this startup's, bag of tricks. They added this product to the thing. And it just didn't get the attention that it needed. It was a big deal for the startup. They thought, oh, wow, we got a distribution deal with Kaplan. And we have, we're going to be sold to all the Kaplan's customers. But the Kaplan sales guys weren't really motivated to sell it. So this was like an investment of time of the startup where they really worked hard to get it into the bag, and then the sales didn't materialize. The expectations were really high, and the sales delivery was really low. So I think more of those business development deals are tougher because there is so much of a cultural difference between the big company and the startup. I like more transactional deals. Like, I can use this. So Kaplan paid for the product, and they actually were a customer of the startup, as opposed to a more kind of traditional business development deal where it's kind of like, okay, we're going to give you access to our channels, and you'll pay us for a.
Well, that makes a lot of sense, because if it's something the company can use directly,
Yes.
it's easy to validate internally. But if a small startup is expecting a large enterprise to start pushing the product out through their own channels, there's salesmen that have to be trained up, there's support staff. You're asking the corporate to put their own brand at risk, and it is a much harder sale.
Correct.
Okay. Well, Don, before you were talking about how the startup employees who worked with the startup, or excuse me, the corporate employees who worked with the startups tried to take these new techniques and this new energy and this new rapid decision making and bring it back internally. And that's challenging. You've worked in large companies. I have, Oscar, I know you have as well. And the controls that exist in large companies are there for good reasons. What is the best way, or what are some ways you think that are effective to bring in those learnings into large organizations? How can they practically use what they learn to develop small changes internally?
That is
You
hard.
wanna jump on
I guess.
this?
That is really hard because every business is different. One of the examples that I really like is the company called Zappos, this online retailer. And although they used to be a startup and they're a tech company, one of the things that they did that really inspired me is the people that were doing talking to customers, that calling in, etc. They got a budget of about, I don't know, $300 a day, that they could spend whatever they thought was interesting or good enough to help their client with solving an issue, instead of saying, sorry, I have to talk with my boss and blah, 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 and all that. And it was even more than that, I guess. So
Yeah.
It is just little things that start this culture of giving people the freedom to act upon signals, what's happening, and it's not about permission, it's about, sorry, I did the wrong thing, but I'll make it better next time. And this is an open atmosphere, and you start with that. That's a cultural thing.
Well,
one of the things.
and sometimes, especially in Japan, the cost of the control, the cost of the control function is higher.
It's a system.
Than
yeah, it is a system. Yeah.
than giving the sales rep, $50 or $100
Yeah.
discretionary.
Yeah.
Don, what do you think? You had some
Yeah.
good thoughts on it before.
Yeah, I think, there's a pretty, it used to be that, as Oscar mentioned, people used to think of startups as just little, big, companies. And I think now there's a big literature around startup methodology, and it's called the lean startup methodology, right? And so it's very simple. It's kind of like, it's just you applying the scientific method to business startups, because there's a lot of uncertainty around business startups, right? It's not like, Procter & Gamble doing one crest, a regular crest, and now they're going to do a mint flavored crest. And that's a very known, how many channels it's going to go to. There's not that much uncertainty. If you're going to invent a new product or service, you have no idea who's going to use it, why, what, where, there's a lot of uncertainty. And all the lean methodology is about is applying the scientific method to a startup. There's a lot of uncertainty. Let's go try something. And quite frankly, Google had a policy where they gave their best engineers 20% of their time to go play around and experiment. And it's pretty easy to experiment, meaning you don't have to start a new project and get a big budget approved. It's kind of like in this day and age with the tools that we have today, you can put up a web page or a value proposition, and they call it a minimal viable product. You can put up a minimal viable product that's kind of just a test experiment. So every experiment is a way to learn. And so and you can do it very rapidly. It shouldn't require the decision making and the hierarchy. It's kind of like, hey, listen, I'm going to give you X% of your time and go try some stuff.
Build, measure, learn.
Build, measure, learn. And that's the lean startup methodology. And it's really easy to do. And it shouldn't require a lot of decision making because we're deploying very little resources in the beginning. To put out a little experiment costs maybe somebody's, 3 hours of somebody's time. That's the investment you're making, and that seems like a very small investment that shouldn't have to go through layers of management to make that decision. And I think it's starting to do that. And what we saw at Kaplan was, yes, that's what they started to do. It's kind of like in maybe even their marketing ideas. So instead of like they had a product and they had a bunch of ideas about how to market it, they started to just go experiment. Like, we don't know which marketing tactic's going to work as best. Let's go try this one, get some data back, and try this one and do A/B testing. And like those little experiments were just easy ways to start to change your culture.
So in other words, you create the structure within the organization that these are experiments. These aren't programs. These aren't part of the project management process.
And they don't need a big budget, and you don't need to like go approve the budget and go through an 8-month planning process to get the budget for this experiment. You have that experimentation embedded into your culture.
Sorato, what do you think? Because I know it's harder to bring these back into Japanese companies, but
Yeah, I have never worked for a big company, so I don't answer this question.
okay. Well, I'll throw in my thoughts, particularly in terms of Japanese companies trying to change. I think that Japanese companies should not look to startups and should not be trying to change the corporate culture. They need to dream small, if you would. So if you look at, so it shouldn't be changing the culture so that everyone's an innovator and everyone's an entrepreneur. So if you look at society at large, I don't know, maybe 0.5% of the population are coming up with ideas and trying crazy things, and the rest of the population kind of keeps society running. And that's true within an organization. So I think that maybe whatever these lessons they bring back in only need to apply to a very small part of the staff, but that staff needs to be protected and nurtured. But it doesn't have to be a company-wide change.
No, but I'm not sure if this was a scientific figure, but 0.5%?
I just made that up.
No, but I think that you will be amazed if you give people space to experiment and to play around and to make mistakes and allow that. You'll be amazed to see how many people actually are entrepreneurial by default. But we're so used to draw between the lines and make sure that nothing goes wrong. And that is something that you can change by doing little things and having good examples within the company that inspire people and everyone has access to, and it's not just for the high potentials, it's for everyone. And I guess the best thing is to change culture by making it accessible. It's called open innovation for a reason, right? It's like inviting people to participate. There's way more entrepreneurial mindset and creativity than we think that we've seen over the last, 60, 100 years, really.
But I think it is a real tension that Tim brings up, in the sense that if you're a big corporation, that means you've been a successful startup and now you're a billion-dollar company because you were unbelievably successful. And now you have to be a statesman of those resources and those assets. You know, you can't just go roll the dice and lose the $1 billion tomorrow, right?
Of course not.
You have to protect.
Whereas, you know, in entrepreneurship, you know, you're spending your money, your own time and energy, and the risk is less. And so what I think the finding, the tension is, there's certain people that are going to continue to manage the business, and there's processes to managing the business, but you can always experiment around the edges of those processes. Yep. So a big company can't just all of a sudden have a bunch of entrepreneurs running around. I would agree with Tim, but they can start to embed more ideas for change, more ideas for incremental innovation, as well as more disruptive innovation, and help those people be able to do it without getting chastised. Or you know, you're rewarded for experimenting and trying things out and learning. And if you fail, sometimes that's okay. And I think that's the problem in a lot of corporations is like, if you fail, I'm never going to try it again, or I lost my bonus because I tried an experiment. Like, that's not going to be helpful, right? So there are these alignment incentive systems.
Exactly. There need to be some way to protect, because you know, every salesman, you might have a salesman who's come up with an idea for a great new product, and he'll mention it to his boss, and his boss, in some ways quite correctly, will say, what are you talking about? You've got a quota. You know, next quarter is closing in 2 weeks. Go out and sell something. And that idea needs to be protected somehow within the organization.
Yeah. So don't, it's like in big companies, the team should be isolated from, or at least having like a way of bypassing the like standard corporate rules and regulations and politics.
Yeah.
You think so?
Well, yeah, because I think, you know, again, I'll go back to the Google example. You know, the engineers that were the star engineers that come up with some of the ideas, they got 20% of their time, and that might be too much in all corporations, but they got 20% of their time to go try stuff out. And it was outside of the budgeting process, it was outside of any regulations. Yeah. You can go do whatever you think's cool and you think might be a market, and just go have at it. And we're going to give you that amount of time, and yes, we'll even give you some resources, like there were some resource centers where you could help someone with UX, UI design or whatever. They had these little kind of resource centers that if you couldn't do it yourself, you could kind of grab somebody's time. So it's a simple, inexpensive way of encouraging experimentation and getting outside of this, you know, complex budgeting process.
Now, in Japan in particular, so I mean, I've lived here for 25 years, love the country, but Japan has got a real issue with failure. There's a real stigma around trying something and having it not work out. In most situations, it's better not to try it than to try it and fail, socially speaking. So in America, I mean, that's true to a lesser extent, but do you think that, I mean, from your experience, has the successful internal innovation, has that been a result of just the different attitude towards failure in the US, or has it been a matter of explicit corporate reframing as this is an experiment, whether it works or not doesn't matter because it's an experiment, you can't fail?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that certainly there's a cultural thing where failure isn't as big, and that is important for the organization to say, we want you to try these things, and we're not gonna penalize you for trying these things. Because even if there's a culture of, oh, you can fail, but if I'm gonna lose 20% of my salary or my bonus for that year, I'm not gonna wanna fail.
So in the States, you almost have a penalty for not trying.
Yes, you know, because they definitely want you to try new ideas, and if you're successful at that new idea, it's a big win, and there's big recognition for you internally in the company. If you lose, you tie it up to training and learning, right? Exactly. So you learn something, and so it's like, what did you learn from that failure? And that's a valuable thing, so that gets valued, and it's okay to fail. Like
move fast and break things. Right?
Yeah. You know, so if you fail, you fail fast. They call that. You know, so fail fast and learn, and then iterate and pivot, so that you try it. You learn something, now you try a new hypothesis. Because you learn something, and now I'm going to say, oh, instead of doing it that way, I'm going to do it this way. And I go fail again, and I fail again, and I keep getting better and getting closer with each failure.
Yeah.
So how have the European companies, large organizations who've done this successfully, how have they done it? Is the culture similar to that in the US, where if you don't try, you seem like kind of a slacker, or
No,
how
it feels
they
like
treat it?
Europe has literally been in between the US and Japan. So one of the companies I grew up with, close to where I lived, where I grew up, is Philips. Philips is an electronics, used to be a consumer electronics company, and they, over the last, since I know them, for the last 50 years, I guess they pivoted 4 or 5 times, big pivots. So they don't sell TVs, they don't sell consumer electronics, they are a medical company right now, and they're scaled down, but they're hugely successful. And I guess that is entrepreneurial thinking. Although it is a big company, no company has ever been born big. They always start with someone finding stuff out and trying, and I guess that Europe has been built, especially since the 40s, 50s, been built by people trying new stuff because we needed to rebuild Europe. Philips is a great example of a company that's pivoted and been rewarded for that as well.
Excellent. Well, listen, we're almost out of time, but before we wrap up, I want to ask you all really briefly, what is the one best piece of advice you could give large companies that are thinking of working with startups? What's the one thing that you could tell them that would prepare them or would help them avoid problems or be most successful with their endeavors?
I used to work, the last job I had 20 years ago was a large American publishing company, and they had this plaque with all these guidelines and rules to live by. And one was, and I still love that, is let's keep an open-minded, let's try it attitude. It's just let's try it. Yeah.
Excellent. Sorato?
It's kind of the same, open-minded and let's try attitude.
Yeah.
Right. Excellent.
Yeah, and again, let's try it is as simple as, give someone permission to go build that, landing page of a website and then try the value proposition. So it's not necessarily that you have to commit, millions of dollars to some startup. Going and trying it is just the first step of the lean startup methodology, customer discovery.
Small start.
Very small start. So it's very simple. Don't overthink it as well. What my advice would be, don't overthink it, just go do it. Whatever the idea is, do a small version of it and go try it, but don't spend a lot of money. Just do a small trial and then learn and keep growing.
Yeah.
And I guess my advice on that would be, additionally, don't be too committed to a specific outcome. When you go into an interaction, you might find a company that's perfect for acquisition. You might find a company that has technology you need internally. You might find a small team that has some really creative ways of marketing or validating a product that you'd never thought of before. But it's going in with keeping an open mind is also going in with no particular expectation of this is what we're going to get out of it.
80% of the companies is getting successful with something else than they figured when they started. 80%. So
that's right. Startups are famous for pivoting.
Yeah.
So 80% what they thought was going to be their business model, their entire business model, turns out it wasn't. So that's probably a fantastic lesson large enterprises can learn at scale. So thank you for sitting down and talking with us, and thank you so much for inviting us here today.
Thank you so much. 改めまして大きな拍手をお願いします。